Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our talks with Walt as we are referencing them. We are now with the poem To the States, poem number 12 from the 24 poems of inscriptions. Think of it this way, we are halfway through, I guess a way to say this, we are halfway through the inscriptions. Remember, we call these the preface poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. When you pick up the deathbed edition, you have these 24 poems that are kind of like, welcome to Leaves of Grass, now let me lay down some groundwork for you. These next two poems, this one, To the States, as well as On Journeys Through the States, notice both of them using the words, the states, right? We're going to have some notion of the ways in which Whitman is going to celebrate the United States of America. Now, just for real quickly, a few assumptions before we get into this discussion as we're doing with all of our lectures here from Leaves of Grass. I hope that you've been following our previous lectures at LearnStrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our little title for these series of lectures. We are, of course, emphasizing the idea that we are the stories we tell and retell. The stories we accept, the stories we reject. So much of that in these next two titles for us. As well, we assume an annotative approach understanding. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? We also assume some knowledge of our big five. What does this text say about epistemology, what you can know? Ontology, who we are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, a whole lot here about this. The study of the group of minds. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why do bad things have to happen? And then finally, our assumption is the 5 P's, or perspectives on Whitman. Whitman is person, Whitman is poet, Whitman is pedagogue. We're going to hear some of that here, that is to say teacher. Whitman is politician, a whole lot of that here in his celebration of democracy. And finally, Whitman is philosopher itself. Now, just to get a bit of background information out of the way, the first appearance of this poem is 1860. The final revision of this poem is 1881. And we need to point out that, in fact, there's an interesting and curious bit of title manipulation that's going on here as well. This poem was first titled Walt Whitman's Caution, right? It was one of the messenger leaves of Leaves of Grass 1860, and appropriately one of the Songs of Insurrection of the 1871-1876 editions of Leaves of Grass before it finally made it into the deathbed edition as we now have it. Here we have, put it in your notes, Whitman as iconoclast. Well, what do we mean by that? Go back to our study of Chaucer. In other words, iconoclastic, iconoblastic. Picking up that aluminum bat and getting ready to bash some things that are considered sacred icons. We're certainly going to have that in play. Think about Thoreau as a contemporary of Whitman playing a very similar kind of game. Now, before we read this poem, let's just think for a moment about the dates of the American Civil War. 12 April, 1861 to 9 April, 1865. Keep that in mind as we begin to think about Whitman as poet to the United States. Let's read the poem now, and then we'll annotate as we finish. To the States. To the States, or any one of them, or any city of the States. Resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. Now, one of the reasons why I love to teach Walt Whitman, like I love to teach Emily Dickinson, is that I can prove to you the power of just a few words. Let's go through this now, annotate this, and let's pay attention to the ways in which this is a pretty radical little poem, and it remains a very radical little poem. Notice we began to the States. Now, this is interesting because he doesn't articulate, definitely specify, he's talking about the United States of America, but because it's Leaves of Grass, the assumption is Whitman, the great poet of democracy, is speaking directly to the American people and, by definition, to the states, of course, that comprise that great country, America. To the states, but notice then there's that fallibilist epistemological position, or any one of them. In other words, I'm talking to all of you as American states, or any city, notice the repetition of the word any, of the states. So in other words, I'm talking to all Americans. This is important. Listen up. And at 2A, you can make the, or at 2B, you can make the observation. Notice we have italicized here. Whitman will do this every once in a while, as we've said already in Leaves of Grass. If he wants to really emphasize something, and then here comes the mantra. Here comes the lesson of the hour. Here comes the instruction to the people of the United States. Resist much. Obey little. Now, note the power of this little mantra, and of course it's going to sound a whole lot like Thoreau's Walden, no question. It's a very powerful Emersonian idea from self-reliance. This idea, of course, is don't you give in so easily. Because once you give in, we got problems. Resist much. Now, of course, America is fundamentally a nation of resistors, right? I mean, from the very beginning, America was a nation of resistors. Here he says, don't take so easily this idea of obeying too much. Obey little, right? Then we have the Anaphoria, that repetition of first words at the beginning of lines, once and once. Notice, once unquestioning obedience. Notice here for your notes, this is the distinction between totalitarianism and democracy. For Whitman, nothing is more precious than the ability to fight, the ability to resist, the ability to say, no, I don't think so. And as I've said in other lectures on LearnStrong.net, if you want to understand American psyche, American thought, it is fundamental to our reading of the Declaration of Independence. That precious document for us, that is to say, don't tell me what to do. You don't tell me, I tell you. You don't tell me. Notice here, once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. And it's compelling that he uses the language of slavery. Frederick Douglass, of course, will resonate with a line like this. Once you no longer are questioning the way you're obeying, you are already starting to become a slave. Think about that as it relates to your education. In our study of Frederick Douglass, we saw this at 3A. That idea that if you can't read and write, if you can't think for yourself, you're a slave. You're a slave to the opinions of others, to the will and the whims of others. Once fully enslaved. Notice we're working now with a Hegelian, almost like a process of thought here, a process of action. Notice, once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, and notice the repetition now of three things. No nation, state, city of this earth. Notice all of a sudden this becomes a global kind of mantra. Ever afterward resumes its liberty. In other words, there is no going back. Once we start down that slippery slope of allowing for our freedoms to be taken away from us, all of a sudden there is no returning back to the key word. I think in many ways the key word of all of Leaves of Grass, the word liberty. It is foundational to appreciating Whitman, to recognize he's the poet of liberty. But liberty means what? Being able to resist. Being able to say, no, I don't think so. I disagree with your position. When you find someone who is trying to keep you from sharing your opinion, you know you're in trouble if you give in. Don't acquiesce. Why? Because once you do that, you're no longer free. You don't understand liberty in any legitimate way. Well, as we play this game, let's go ahead and jot down already. This at 3A will sound very much like Voltaire and Rousseau and the great French Enlightenment thinkers. All of those thinkers playing, of course, with the same idea in the same game. Well, let's now turn to 2A really quickly. Obviously, one of the major messages here is don't ever give up the freedom of resisting. That is foundational to democracy. We never want to be in a situation where we simply have all of us walking lockstep with the same idea. It is a bad idea. You want to be able to compete, to fight, to scrap as Americans. Notice the loss of freedoms, he will point out, are really easy to allow. And after a while, we turn around and we wonder, where did all of our freedoms go? This will be, of course, for Whitman, one of the great horrors, right? At 2B, we've mentioned, notice the Anaphoria as well as the repetition. Notice the speaking directly. Put this in your notes. We're going to see this periodically in Leaves of Grass, where Whitman will become the Tiresias kind of prophet, Jeremiah, Isaiah-like mouthpiece, who will then speak directly to the people. And of course, after Whitman, we will have great orators. We think about Martin Luther King Jr. obviously as a classic example, especially in his I Have a Dream speech, that will speak directly to the American people and challenge them. Challenge them to, of course, be better. Challenge them to be more just, to be more free. At 3a, I've mentioned already Rousseau and Voltaire and the great French Enlightenment tradition. Emerson and Thoreau have to be mentioned here, no question about that. I as well want to, though, mention Emily Dickinson. Much madness is divine sense to the discerning eye. 'Tis the majority in all, she says. If you agree with the majority, you're considered sane. If you disagree with the majority, she calls it demurring. You're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. Go back and take a look at our lecture there on learnstrong.net for that poem. Dickinson as well, appreciating the power and the importance of freedom. As we finish, as we've said at 3b, we want to try and some way own a poem like this. How can we do that? How about this one? What was a time that you had to resist much and obey little? And what were the consequences for that action for you? And as you look back, are you filled with shame or are you filled with pride? To a large degree, obviously, dependent upon the ways in which you think about that action as it relates to other people, the ripple effects. How about this one? How do you balance? This is obviously one of the criticisms of this kind of a poem, right? How do you balance between the two? Resistance and obedience. I mean, obviously, if we're going to live in a society of each other, obviously we have to be able to share and understand each other's differences. Obviously, we have to obey the laws, no question, right? No question. And yet, how do we balance that against the importance of resistance? Go back and take a look, for example, at our lecture on Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. The idea of just war, just law, just ideas versus unjust war, unjust law. And of course we can go back to our study of Sophocles' Antigone as well to play this game. When is it right to stand up and say no? When is it right to say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and obey. Even if I don't agree, I'm going to obey because I'm part of a society. And sometimes in a society, you have to obey even if you don't agree. How do you balance those two kinds of things in the end? And to what degree in the end, then, are you able to get what you need and want politically, while at the same time finding ways to fit into society and to make sure that you are a part of the larger group? This tension between the individual and society is, of course, John Stuart Mill's classic on liberty. It is a challenge for us to be able to somehow balance those two things. Well, this is one of those poems to the States that I hope challenges you. And come on back and we'll mess around some more with Talks with Walt. Thank you.